Hi, my name is Manfred Schoch, and today we want to talk about the impact of remote work, or mobile work as we called it, on communication and collaboration behavior. The pandemic changed our communication behavior, and there are several data sets that show us that this is the case. The first one that I want to present is from Microsoft. They analyzed their own the behavior within their own systems and showed that digital meetings, for example, increased by 147%, so dramatic increase in that. And we can also see that emails increased. They don't show a percentage here. We will see later why that is the case, because the increase was actually not that big. Then there's an increase in chat, instant messaging, and an increase in the number of documents, so Word or PowerPoint documents that people worked on throughout the year following the pandemic. You can see March 2020 was in many instances when the first restriction, the first physical distancing measures got released, came to be, and you can see that it increased steadily until maybe April or May, and then a solid plateau was found and maintained throughout the entire year. So a lot more digital communication is what this slide shows. Similar study that we did in a German service organization. We analyzed Microsoft Teams usage data, and we saw from the introduction of Microsoft Teams, which here was in 2019, so well before the pandemic, it steadily increased just as the system became more mature. And then with the new work from home policies, we really see a dramatic increase in all functionalities. The dark blue bar here are chat messages, so again instant messaging, then also meetings or calls, spontaneous calls, and channel messages, which is a little bit different. I'll not go into detail here, because the important thing here is you can see that really within the Microsoft suite, but also in individual companies within Germany, you saw a dramatic increase in digital communication throughout the pandemic. And that was maintained for a long time, sometimes even beyond the work from home restrictions. When people were allowed back into the office, not everybody came. And so that level of digital communication really stayed. Now Microsoft has another study where they go into more detail about their own communication behavior within their company. And they show us a little bit more on where these changes originate from, like what did people do differently. And here you can see there's a dotted line at 0, and there's a normalized rate of change. So less scheduled meetings would be on the blue dot would be on the left of this dotted line, and more usage or change to more unscheduled meetings, for example, is on the right of the dotted line. And the whiskers are the standard deviation, show you what the spread is between different individuals. And you can see that scheduled meeting hours actually decreased a little bit. This is not digital meetings, but meetings in general. They got a little bit less. And then unscheduled meeting hours is really what increased dramatically. So people tried to compensate maybe for the lack of physical presence or informal communication through this unscheduled meetings. Hours spent in meetings and calls, relatively similar. Direct messages increased enormously. Emails, not so much, as I pointed to earlier. And the weekly working hours increased a little bit as well. We see that in many studies, and that is a little bit of a side effect of the flex work, because it spreads out your workday more as you are more flexible. And a lot of times that leads to employees actually working more rather than less, what some employers think is happening. In any case, to the right, I have summarized two important things. One is there's a tendency towards more asynchronous rather than synchronous communication, so more messaging, more emails that don't necessarily take place at the same time. You can answer a message several hours after it was sent. And then possible complication through this asynchronous communication. Why is that the case? Because we know through media richness theory that the choice of asynchronous communication media makes it more difficult to transfer complex information. So the more complex information, the more difficult it is obviously to understand, and you need maybe your hands to demonstrate what you're talking about, and you cannot see that in a text message. So it's difficult to codify, and therefore there may be problems with the switch to asynchronous communication. The second slide shows the contexts, so not the digital media that is used, but whom people communicate with. And we can see that the number of work contacts overall didn't change much, but the number of associated departments decreased. So there's less communication between different departments and more communication within departments. Then there's this interdepartmental contact thing, which is similar, and the amount of time spent with other departments. Again, this is the number. This is the time spent decreased, and the amount of time spent with weaker contacts decreased. Now, what does that mean? There are contacts that you might be very familiar working with. Maybe you have some colleagues who you study with, and you always talk to them in the breaks or leading up to a test. You talk to them about maybe problems you've encountered with the lectures, and those are strong contacts. Those are maybe your good friends. And then there are weaker contacts who you don't necessarily talk to, but sometimes you do. And weaker contacts are set to provide you with new information, because the other people, you know them well, and there's probably a reason why you know them well, because you are sitting in the same lectures maybe. So a lot of what they know, you already know. But with your weaker contacts, it might be completely new information that you haven't been exposed to. And that kind of maybe rounds it up. What is happening with this increased digital communication or increased remote work? Well, you communicate more in silos. You communicate more within your department, and you communicate more with people that you already know. And the spontaneous communication with other people who you're not familiar with other departments who you don't normally work with, they decrease. And that is a factor that contributes to creativity, to knowing what's going on in the organization, maybe connecting some dots, maybe solving some issues that you've had for a while rather quickly because you are talking to somebody who has new information. All of that is problematic with remote work. What's the message here? What does it tell us? It tells us that remote work does work, but there's a role for the physical office that remains. And let's try to grasp that. What is that role? Well, first of all, maybe the positive side of remote work. Work can be completely detached from the physical office. It is possible. Many meetings can be replaced by virtual meetings. Many unscheduled exchanges also work through digital communication channels. And one thing that we haven't talked about in the previous slides, but other studies tell us that concentration on single tasks, we sometimes call it monotasking, without interruptions actually works better when you're away from your colleagues at home. But obviously that's not exactly the same for every employee. If you're maybe a parent of children and you don't have a private office space in your house, then you will have a lot of interruptions in the home office as well. So there's a difference between different employees here that needs to be taken into account, but generally concentration might work well in remote work. Here comes the but. Remote work has its negative aspects. The transfer of complex information becomes more difficult. Interpersonal relationships and contacts are partly lost or displaced by closer ties whom you're already familiar with. And the informal exchange, sometimes we call it water cooler exchanges. So maybe you meet somebody in the kitchen or in the bar area that you're not familiar with, and you run into, and there's an interesting conversation that arises from it. So that's really something that is problematic, and that's also something that is associated with the organizational culture. What do we draw from that? The office is no longer the only working place, and that will probably remain that way for quite some time, or maybe forever. But it still offers advantages that remote work cannot. What are those advantages? There's an interesting study that summarizes 3 key advantages of the physical office. First, the office is a social anchor. So face-to-face interactions, the water cooler meetings that I talked about, short face-to-face conversations that weren't planned, but maybe solve some problems efficiently. All of that happens in the office, and offices, and we will get to that, need to be designed so that the social contact can take place there. And the second aspect is the office as a schoolhouse. New employees learn from observing others. They need to be able to ask questions, and not only in scheduled meetings once a week. How are you doing? Is everything going well with you? But all the time, if you're sitting next to somebody in an office, you can ask them, well, where do I find this? Where do I find that? I have a problem here. Can you help me? And that is really something that is difficult in the digital space, because you're hesitant to contact people. You don't know what they're doing right now. You don't know if they're nice. You don't know if they want to help you. And you can see that much better in the physical world. And also, as we said, complex knowledge, transferring complex knowledge is done better via face-to-face contact. And that is something that obviously needs the physical office. And obviously something that new employees need, because they need to learn a lot. And then the last thing is the office is a place for unstructured collaboration. So really employees may solve complex problems together, maybe use whiteboards or get creative together, discuss certain things, maybe get others involved in the conversation if they're stuck with something. So this whole aspect of unstructured collaboration, maybe even creativity, is something that works better in the office. So as you can see, the physical office really has an important role in this new way of working, and in future sessions we will explore more what that means and how it needs to be designed. Thank you for listening.